norms if we want to actually figure out how to get people critically engaged with the implications of machine learning systems and particular ones. So we are, as we all know, handing off human functions to machines, and in particular to algorithms, we're handing off a whole host of decision-making, or at least decision support activities. And these are in the criminal justice setting, in the healthcare setting, even robo-advisors. And in the transition to these machine learning algorithms, while we have similar concerns that we've seen historically with expert systems, for example, or even the evolution to use technology to vote on, right, which were not complex machine learning systems, but rather systems that could be designed, we've always had concerns about the displacement of expert judgment. We've had concerns about the extent to which regulators or people who are procuring systems can ensure that the professional or domain-specific expertise is being reflected in them. But machine learning systems present some particular challenges. And what are those? Well, one, unlike an expert system where we actually have a design phase, right, where we figure out collaboratively, hopefully, there's a whole field of requirements engineering that focuses on how to extract requirements from legal texts, how to collaborate with people in particular domains to make sure that there's some fidelity between what the system thinks the rules are and what the people who are going to be relying on it think the rules are. Machine learning systems, you choose an algorithm and the data basically becomes the trainer, right? And so there's a different meaning of design. And this means that, one, there has to be much greater attention to the data, but it also means that design doesn't happen in a similarly fixed point. Second, sorry, I'm having a little challenge here because I don't have my notes, I'm realizing. Sorry. Second, some of these algorithms, as we've heard earlier today, can be very difficult to scrutinize. It's not true of all machine learning algorithms, but some of them, even if we set aside barriers such as trade secrecy and we say you have to disclose the code, even if we have experts with the right sort of credentials, they're not going to be able to tell us reliably why a particular thing is being identified as the right course of action, right? That these systems are not interpretable in that particular way. And finally, these systems are both probabilistic and dynamic, right? And that probabilistic means that there isn't one right outcome, right? Typically, when we think about designing a system to support decision-making, an expert system, Danielle Citron wrote quite some years ago now about a system that was being used in the context of benefit distributions, right? Those systems were not probabilistic. They were these if-and rules, right? And there was an answer. It could have embedded some biases because we chose the rules poorly or cleaned the data poorly, but there was an answer rather than a range of answers, right? It was not a probabilistic system. And second, it wasn't a dynamic system in two ways. One, these dynamic systems, they may actually rely on different features when making decisions about different people. And two, the features that they rely on to make these probabilistic decisions may change over time as they learn from the data, right? So for all of these reasons, as we move from expert systems to predictive systems, we have some challenges that I think are unique. So I want to talk a little bit about some of the responses that we've seen to date, and this comes from some work I'm doing with a postdoc and a PhD student that's just trying to map some of the ways in which people are using terms, because we're using terms, transparency, interpretability, explainability, as though we all know what they mean, and as though we use them the same across disciplines. And as somebody who works pretty routinely with people in computer science and engineering and social sciences, one thing I do is spend a lot of time in the translation trenches, right? So transparency, just as an example, right, in the statistical and social sciences, we really think about opening up the design and analysis, the process for others to use. very much aligned with the reproducible research movement, right? When they think about it's not just disclosing code. In computer science and law, it tends to be much more narrowly construed around this idea of openness, disclosing the code, sharing the code, or at least allowing some sort of expert review of it. Much less focus on the development of the model or the cleaning of the data, right? And we know that those are both serious issues in the context of machine learning systems. Interpretability and intelligibility aims more at either the model or the system, asking the question of does it make sense to the humans, or to the outputs of the model or the system, does it make sense? And the general response has been efforts to constrain the class of potential models or systems to those that do either A or B or both, right? And typically these demands for understanding don't apply to the techniques used to train the models, the data collection, the cleaning, and not completely to kind of the first issues around design. So explainable AI and machine learning is something that's being pushed not just from folks who are concerned about fairness, but more on the kind of safety and human compatible AI, right? How do we ensure if the machines are learning about us in order to work effectively with us, we also need to be able to work with them, right? That these are partnerships. We're not supposed to become slaves in any way, right? And the explainable AI in the social sciences, there's a real focus on both process and product, right? So process, explainability as the transmission of an answer, and product, the explanation is an answer to the question, but with different sorts of foci, right? So sometimes it's causal, right? We're going to present the reasons why an event occurred. This is usually limited, right? So we select particular attributes tend to get highlighted, right? If we're trying to explain why a particular thing happened. Sometimes it's contrastive, right? So why X happened instead of Y. These two tend to be selective. Like what are the features or variables that were most likely to lead to the outcome that you didn't want? And I think interestingly and importantly to me that sometimes there's a focus on explainability about explanations as a means to transfer knowledge, right? Literally as a way to bridge between the way in which the machine is thinking and the way in which the human is thinking, right? So this knowledge transfer component. In explainable AI and machine learning on the computer science side, this is more likely to mean we're going to do an entire description of the model and the system, or we're going to look for systems that produce rules that can be identified and interrogated. Those are what the aims are. Okay. So Kathy in the last presentation said, I think we need to stop, I'm going to paraphrase, I think we need to stop yelling at the engineers, right? Saying like, why are you doing this? Like, what's your problem? And my own experience, I'm not as active a participant in the FAT-ML as Michael is, but I have been engaged in research and collaborations with computer scientists around issues of privacy and fairness for quite some time. And at least on the theoretical and system design level, think that they take these issues seriously. And like to suggest that maybe another place that we should be focusing on is, to kind of get to Kathy's point, kind of our professional dispositions to algorithms. And I want to look at the way in which healthcare decision support systems are being imagined by professionals and the kinds of demands they're putting on them, and contrast that with the judiciary risk recidivism systems and the way in which professionals in those communities are seem to be looking at them. So the healthcare domain, these are some like nice quotes from a piece by Goodman, pretty recent, and they were looking at particularly the adoption of technology and just talking about the way in which it's reflected in kind of progressive caution, right? That they want to optimize decision support use by encouraging expansion of the field, but with appropriate levels of scrutiny, oversight, and indeed caution. And the FDA, as many of you may know, actually decided to exclude a whole range of clinical decision support systems from device regulations as a general matter. They can be sucked back in for different reasons. I don't want to get too in the weeds on this particular provision, but the things that can be excluded enable healthcare professionals to independently review the basis for the recommendations, right? The goal is that these systems that are going to be not considered devices under FDA regulations have to be things that enable healthcare professionals to independently review the basis of recommendations. And basically, they're to be assistive, they're not to be a displacement. So in looking around at how the healthcare institution has been, and doctors in particular have been thinking about this. I've spent some time talking with the AMA, but I also was looking at guidelines that have been coming out, and this is a set of guidelines from, I guess, an association of clinical decision support system creators. And they are focused on things that I think really resonate with some of our concerns, right? That in thinking about transparency, they want to make sure that the function and limits, right, which I think is an exceedingly important component of understanding a system, are communicated. They want to make sure that there's an indication of the certainty or reliability, like what do the error bars look like, or the probabilistic possibilities. Real disclosures about inputs, both patient input, but also the source of the clinical information or the decisional rules. And in the context where there may be a risk of serious injury or death, it says a reasonable explanation of the clinical logic that communicates the clinical thought process, not necessarily the computer science functionality, right? So a real focus on explanation as a bridging function, right? Trying to communicate how the machine is thinking and to do it in a way that relates to the professional judgment and skill of the professional. But that's not all they're focused on. They're also focused on competent human intervention. And what does that mean? Well, it certainly means that they require the right sort of training, and they want to make sure that the right sorts of professionals are using this, right? That one of the concerns is that if we automate something, all of a sudden, we don't need a doctor to actually look at the result. We can have some lower level person look at the result from that decision support system. So very focused on making sure that these are used to enhance or augment professional competencies, not to grow the pool of people who might try to act like a doctor, right, or do interpretive work. And finally, and this will become important later, a real interest in what does it mean to have sufficient time to reflect, right? That we don't want doctors in a position using these systems where they have to act immediately, right? Or that the relationship between the time they have to reflect may have a lot to do with whether something is considered to be supportive or is going to actually be considered a medical device and have to go through an FDA compliance process. Because if it's being used like a tool, it's a compass, right? Then we want that thing to be something that doesn't require us to think seriously and interrogate all of its biases and assumptions and limitations. So specifically in looking at what sort of outputs they want, I think it's super interesting and instructive to look at the way in which they deal with expert systems versus learning outputs. There's a section on qualitative outputs too, which you could look at if you'd like. But in the quantitative output from expert systems, they're asking for full and precise mathematical formula, narrative explanations for each step in the calculation, or a reference to the source of the formula, right? This is a pretty detailed sort of disclosure. But from the machine learning outputs, they want you to explain that you've spotted an association through machine learning and state precisely as you can why that is, right? With some kind of human accessible reasoning, which I would suggest is kind of a far cry from what we see above, right? But it reflects some of those limitations that are inherent to the tool. They also go to some length to talk about what does it mean to misuse an algorithmic decision support system. And they talk about using it for a different purpose, right? So if it's supposed to be supporting decision making in this sort of context and you're using it over here, that's misuse. If you're not thinking about disparities in training data and the population on which you're going to use it. If you're using it without training, you're ignorant of the system's design or capacity, right? You don't understand how to use it well. Expansion of participants in the activity, right? This is getting at the, all of a sudden we're going to encourage non-medical professionals to engage in medical decision-making. And then finally, using it without knowledge of how the assumptions, limits, or model align with professional commitments. Now, the reason I highlight these, and I'll get louder, the drumming is for me, actually. I was not in the marching band. I was in the symphonic band, jazz band, too. So I want to turn and just pivot and say, okay, so here's a professional community that is deeply invested and trying to figure out how to couple with machine learning systems in a way that is responsible, productive, and retains professional commitments, right, that are contextually appropriate to the work that they do. And then there's risk recidivism software. Okay, so Ellen has documented that at least at the local level where people are procuring systems, there was pretty little evidence of any engagement with the actual software development process. Most of these things seem to be purchased as kind of commercial off-the-shelf products. Thumbs down. Using for different purpose, I don't know how many of you read the Loomis decision, but like read it and weep, okay? So the thing was designed to be used for bail determinations, and it's being used in sentencing. And what does the court do? It's okay, right? 3, using without respect for disparities in the data trained on and data used on. One of the disclosures that the Wisconsin Supreme Court requires them to make is that this data was trained nationally. There's been no local training. Right now, you're a data science. You're like, WTF? Right? You're a lawyer. Most of them are like, oh, that's good. It means it's like a bigger, more robust data set. I'm like, no, that's not what that means, right? 4, using without training, ignorant of a system's design or capacity. Okay, this is the one that makes me weep more than anything else. So if you read the Solicitor General's brief on the cert petition, where they weigh in and say, don't accept cert on this case, what they say is, on the issue of gender, the issue is not ripe because we cannot tell. I swear to God, it says this. We cannot tell whether or not gender was used as an independent factor or used to norm the results in a way that was fair. Now, either one of those should strike you as incredibly problematic. But the idea that there's a justice system, justice, big J, right, relying on a system where they don't know the answer to that question, do we all feel guilty? And are you balking? I mean, I like, how did that happen? Is it because maybe poor and brown and black people are the people who are being affected by these systems? I'm just going to throw it out there as a possibility. Okay. We shouldn't be expanding participants in activity who do not have the right professional competencies to interact with system outputs. As far as I can tell, there has not been widespread efforts to train people who are using these systems. I've had a little bit of time looking at the training manuals, and I would hope that they're doing a better job, but I really don't know. And then finally, using without knowledge of assumptions and the limits of the model, how they align with professional commitments. I would just suggest that if you don't know how gender is being used, I don't think I need to say anything else. Okay, so how did we get here and how can we address it? So one, this is an issue that's been addressed by Ellen and her colleague, Eaglin in 2016, right, that we need to figure out how to make sure that machine learning systems, algorithmic decision systems generally, are adopted in ways that address the fact that this is not a procurement exercise, right, that there are policy choices all the way down. And that we have to make sure that we have visibility, in particular political visibility, into the choices being made. And my colleague Ken Bamberger and I are particularly interested in making sure that whether agencies are doing this as an adoption of a technology they want to use or the regulation of a technology that's going to be used, that accountability, participation, and transparency track how values and technological infrastructure play out in continuum. It's not just at design time. It's at configuration time, it's at runtime, and it is iterative, right? And we need systems that reflect that. But we also need to foster professional judgment, right? We can make sure that these tools better reflect the professional judgments of domain-specific areas through those sort of front-end processes. But we also need to foster professional judgment in the moment. And what does that mean? Well, for me, I think it means that we need to shift our lens from a focus on explaining to people and actually create systems that engage us in critical practices, right? That we're lawyers and we are taught to reflect on what we're doing. There's a whole movement in design that is about critical design and critical technical practice, getting people to actually reflect on the values in the stuff and the things and their tools of work. And so I'm really drawn to this issue of this idea of contestability. And I want to suggest that there's a few people, I think, who are already looking at this in the computer science literature. So Rich Karuna at Microsoft has been looking particularly in the healthcare domain at using intelligible and accurate models. They use this generalized additive models with pairwise interactions, which I'm sure Michael would love to talk to you all about. And I'm happy to answer some questions, but you could quickly get over my head. But the key is that it allows doctors to review in a very modular way what features are leading to particular recommendations for treatment, and it allows them to edit them, right? And this is a very different sort of approach. Second, I want to point to the work of Ming, 2017, 2 different papers, a researcher at Carnegie Mellon University, relatively focused on the kind of interaction design space, not just the kind of algorithmic space. And her work has been super interesting in that she's documented the way in which definitions of fairness vary, even in the same communities that are engaged in the same kind of work. And more importantly, that fairness has both substantive and procedural dimensions, something we all know as lawyers, right? But so if we want to think about using these systems in contexts where there are contested concepts at issue, we need to not just make sure that the computer scientists get the right definition of fairness, we actually need to surface ways that people can discuss which fairness applies in which context. And finally, there's been some work going all the way back to examinations of spam filtering software and their relative interpretability by lay people that distinguish between shallow and deep understanding. And I think one of the things that contestability can do is promote deep understanding, which means that you don't just understand that you understand the reasoning of the machine, right? So if you give me an example and a classification, I can explain to you why that happened, not just that I can put things in the right bucket, right? And I think those are the sorts of things that contestability should be aiming to do that I think explainability, interpretability, transparency fall short on. So what are some of the benefits of contestability? One, communicating about uncertainty and supporting expert feedback from professional communities improves decisions in the moment and over time, right? Because the system can learn. It increases trust in systems, that when people actually understand not just what you're telling them to do, but why, right? You all have had children, or many of you have, you understand, right? It maintains feelings of user responsibility, which for me, from my perspective, when I look at the response of healthcare professionals and folks in the judicial system, we need to foster feelings of responsibility, right? That this is a problem. It can allow expressions of varying tolerances for type 1 or type 2 errors. The Craner paper here from 2011 is a really interesting one, just looking at a decision support system for reading tumors and talking about if you're a researcher or you're a surgeon, you may have really different feelings about type 1 and type 2 errors just in reading images and determining whether or not they are potentially cancerous. And then finally, I think it facilitates engagement with ambiguous and contested concepts and can improve perceptions of fairness and equity in the use of these systems. So what I want to say is that addressing democratic deficits and algorithmic moral hazard means that we have to make sure that these decision support systems in professional work are not viewed as tools to be acquired, but rather as informational texts that require public and professional engagement at design time and runtime. The processes of adopting these tools need to be viewed as policy, not procurement. I think the law should ensure that professionals have skin in the game, because that is what's going to engender critical reflection. And for those of you who teach any information law and policy, the Aetna v. Jepson case, where the pilots initially are viewed as completely not negligent because there was a set of maps, one being the topographical and the other being the vertical. I'm not thinking of the right word right now, elevation, right? And they were presented, typically they'd be in the same scale, and the map company presented them in the different scale, and the pilots drove the plane into the side of a mountain. And the appeals court in California was like, you've got to be kidding me, right? Like, we're not going to say that because the map was bad, the pilots who drove into the side of the mountain have no responsibility for what happened. Right? And I think that same sort of thing, right? We need to figure out ways to cultivate professional skin in the game. And finally, we should engender critical professional practice, and the contestability can support that. Thank you. There was no timer on that, so I have no idea how long it went.
Do you have any ideas?
No, because I couldn't get the thing up, so I couldn't see the time.
Yeah, apparently.
It's just my slide.
I think when we tried to do that thing with the notes, it put it on this virtual lecture.
Ah.
Or something.
Okay, sorry.
And this works? Okay, yeah, it works. Okay. And this is off. Oh, no. Off. It's not good. How's this? Is this good? Is this on? All right. Okay, so, and I can move around, right?
Yeah.
I didn't ask beforehand. Everyone's behind here. Okay, all right, wake up, here we go. So this talk actually follows very nicely from Deirdre, so I think we've got some continuity. It also flows well from the earlier remarks from Michael and from Kartik. I don't know where he is. So when you're watching this at home, just reorder the conference and put those first before this. So my talk today, I mean, it's the top 10 threats to fairness for your top 10 ranking algorithm. Ha ha, you know, number 8 will surprise you. You get the reference. But really, I mean, I could retitle this talk based on Deirdre's. I think, you know, the idea is, like, you know, she made the point that fairness has substantive and procedural dimensions and that they're important to consider. And I think that's really the theme I'd like to continue on from your conclusion. A story about me, when Kevin was writing after the Digital Tornado, yeah, the original, I was in college, so I can't reflect that much on the era. But I moved to a different town to go to college. I moved to UC Davis, Davis, California, and I noticed that the traffic lights in Davis tended to flash red a lot. And I'm not talking about the traffic light flashing red like after 10 p.m. they switch it to red, but at Davis they would flash red randomly, different traffic lights, and one day they'd be red flashing and the next day they wouldn't. And it tells you something about the kind of college kid I was, that I really wanted to know more about this, and so I started looking into how traffic lights work. You know, it turns out they have a signal controller box, and this is a nice painted one from Ireland, but they have a signal controller box and they have a signal controller, and it's programmed. And in the box, they also have this other thing called a monitor. And this is related to my other work on algorithm auditing. So it's an auditing process. And the monitor, the cool thing about the monitor is that the monitor is not necessarily related to the signal controller at all. It's a totally independent system. You can buy it from a different manufacturer. And all the monitor does is it looks at the lights that are coming out. This is a new monitor. The EDI-MMU 16LE IP. You're not supposed to plug into the internet, by the way. That's not what that's for. So basically, it just looks at all the lights, and if the signal controller is going to send a green light to two paths of traffic that are going to intersect, it takes away control from the signal controller. So it there's a relay, and it switches it off, and usually the way it handles that is it goes into the light flashing mode until someone, at that time, when I was in college, would have to go and press the button. And the most common reason that would happen was actually that the signal engineer sucked. He did a bad job of programming the signal controller, so he wrote something that caused intersecting passive traffic, so he got the flashing light. I think this is an interesting way to think about system safety. There's many different ways that system engineering thinks about safety, and this is just one example, but I think the monitor is actually the kind of metaphor for algorithmic system safety that I'd like to explore a little bit in this talk. I actually searched for after the tornado instead of after the digital tornado. And this is one of the things that comes up. But then I thought, oh, I made a mistake. But then I thought, no, I think Kevin, this is what he was thinking. Like this has been sort of the tone of the conference a little bit, right? I was going to say something like "Welcome to the backlash" or something like that, but we've been in the backlash for a few years now. We've had a number of speakers comment on it, saying things like the engineers are tired of them being beaten up on. I think the internet is kind of like this. The earlier talks reflecting on 20 years ago are really reminding me of the way that we thought about it is so different. Like Bill Gates was a bad guy and now he's a good guy and everything is just turned on its head. But one interesting way to think about the legacy, the 20-year span between that paper and today, is that in the recent years, I think we've had something called the death of reverse chronological order, or the death of the simply sorted list. I was trying to think of the context in which Kevin wrote that paper, and really, there weren't that many instances where you had complicated sorting of anything that the user would be involved in. You could say, I was using Pine at that time. I don't know if anyone else remembers Pine. And you could search like text for keywords, but generally you used reverse chronological order for a lot of things that were sorted. And when AltaVista came out, it had rankings, but the rankings, initially they were just like, they counted the number of times the word appeared in the page, and that was the ranking. So it's not like hard to explain the ranking, right? So everything was not sorted in a complicated way. And one other thing about this that is interesting and relevant to us is that the death of reverse chronological order is really pretty recent from the user's perspective. So, the Facebook newsfeed, it wasn't filtered when it first came around. It was just reverse chronological order. So just in the last couple of years, think about your online experience and, you're opening up your Gmail and I've got the little importance darts and I've got the tabbed view, the priority inbox they call it, right? And I'm going to go over to Steam and it's going to do a matchmaking process to recommend who I'm going to play a video game with. It's going to suggest some games for me to buy. It's going to suggest some ads. In the game itself, the kind of things that happen to my character are going to be recommended by a curation algorithm in some cases. Search, social media, email, it's all curated, and it's all curated by algorithms. I'm kind of limiting my talk to this, although I admire the breadth of the earlier speakers. I'm terrified by it. So I'm really explicitly talking about automated curation, ranking, recommendation. That's enough. Other people are going into self-driving cars, and let's just stick here. So focusing on this. Focusing just on this, I think we're clear from the earlier speakers, although I maybe use a different vocabulary. Relevance in these systems is co-produced by data, algorithms, and users, and it's a complicated process. And my perspective is science and technology studies. One interesting thing about thinking about systems in a kind of STS way is that it makes it really hard to talk to anyone outside of STS about it. This is my personal view. I don't know, people will disagree, but my personal experience, because you insist on this level of nuance and complexity that is impossible. And so you're like, well, but systems are subtle and beautiful and ideological, and what about power, and what about history, and what about materialism? And you want to know how the traffic light works. And you say like, what about Marx? What about the doorknob? And that's the way you're trained to think, right? And so I had this interesting, an interesting example of this. This is the really great named conference. I really like the name of this conference. I just want to say that the Fat Star Conference, which is a conference expanded beyond machine learning to talk about these topics. In these conferences, one of the interesting things that's happened to the FAT-ML that Michael talked about is that there's been this really exciting recognition that in these systems, fairness is important. And there's been a flowering of exciting work that was just described by our two earlier speakers about fairness from a technical perspective. And it's thrilling and it's exciting, but it also has something that we might, this is an example. This is the Principles for Accountable Algorithms that came out of 2017 or 16? 16, yeah. But there's really a narrower focus on a particular kind of fairness. So the literature is flowering, but the people in this area really focus on, it's like they read the Fair Housing Act in the United States and the Civil Rights Act, and there's certain protected categories, and this is it, man. If I can get this right, it's fair. And if you're not in that domain, you look at it and you think fairness and you think of something else. And so there's this, Michael had this interesting cycle of research in this area. And that's a great way of thinking about it. I hadn't thought of it that way, but I do think that's what's going on, is that they take a definition of statistical fairness, usually, apply it to the idea of fairness based on protected categories, and that's it. So what I'd like to argue for you today is that we can do much more interesting things. I'd like to give these exciting people in the FAT community a different research agenda, or an expanded research agenda. And to do that, I'm going to talk about something I call Gray's checklist problem. Mary Gray, a renowned and wonderful anthropologist, was speaking actually with Deirdre. She was there, and she said, and she was talking about this idea that other speakers have called the two cultures. Catherine said the two cultures. Deirdre said the transparency trenches. Like this idea that there are meetings like this one where you have a technical and a something else that come together. And Mary Gray says, I find it sort of happens like this. The engineers or the technical people, they say, gosh, I really hate it that everyone thinks that I'm evil and racist and bad, and this is terrible. Everyone's beating up on my company or my system, and I want some requirements or a checklist that are going to get me out of it. And then the social person says, well, remember my earlier comments about STS? Well, there's not really a checklist for that. If you're a lawyer, you say well, we haven't figured out a procedure for justice. It's not something that we can solve that easily. It's not really a checklist thing. And then they kind of are at an impasse. And in some cases, which I guess if you were from the social or the STS perspective, you might consider this a success, although it's of dubious practicality. You can convert the engineers to abandon the checklist, but then they don't do anything because they're like, oh, it's hopeless. It's like nihilism. We can't do anything. So I think Mary, who I'm sure will watch this at some point, I think Mary was trying to point out that we have to get past this impasse, and I think she would not propose the situation the solution that I'm proposing. My proposal would be to Gray's checklist problem. What if we just went ahead and made everything a really reductionist checklist anyway? And it's a very non-STS solution to this problem, and it goes against my training, and it's very hard to do. The reason I propose that is I think in some ways the impasse that Mary described in social and technical situations, I fault somewhat the lawyers, the business people, the social scientists, because I feel like we could do more to explain these things. And other people have said the same thing in earlier panels. So one of the things that's interesting about the metaphor of the monitor, remember the monitor, the traffic lights, college? One of the interesting things about the monitor is we're kind of building the monitors now, and the question isn't sort of like, can the social scientists come up with a checklist, or can the STS come up with a checklist? It's more like, we're building things like these monitors into algorithmic systems, and so is it going to be based on a narrow definition of statistical fairness and these protected categories in US law that aren't particularly internationally relevant, or will it be something else? And so, in the future, you could imagine your ISO 802.11 wireless card working with your email, and maybe some ads come up that are really offensive, but you say, don't worry, it's an ISO 7003 certified sort, so it's okay. So the question is what goes in to the ISO 7003 certified sort? And that's a conversation we need to be a part of. So I have 10 ideas here, and I admit, I think I've designed this part of my talk so it will irritate the entire audience, because I'm grossly simplifying ideas that many people have worked for their careers on, particularly in philosophy. I'm terrified of Helen, actually. But the work has been a huge inspiration. It's been a huge inspiration, and I hope that saves me. And likewise, I'm really talking down to the engineers in the technical community. So I'm simplifying everything to everyone, and so let's see how that goes. My argument is that, number one on the list of fairness that you could have a monitor for, or that you could be concerned about, is the kind that we've already dealt with. It's the kind that's in the FATML resources page. It's the kind where the literature in fairness from machine learning is going, and that's comparative. And so, this is sort of cribbed from when I used to teach applied ethics. And you heard comparative fairness over and over again in the presentations at this conference. And you even heard statements that look like the formal principle of comparative justice. It was sort of like, the groups in the same circumstances have to be treated in the same way, and da-da-da-da. So that's great, but what if we add another 9? Like, there's other ways we can think about this, and this should be a research agenda for people designing things like monitors. And monitor, again, is kind of a metaphor here. Like, it could be a monitor that's in a system. It could be a monitor that's outside a system. It could be monitoring a programmer's work. It could be monitoring a company's work. It could be monitoring a nation's work, right? So it's a metaphor, right? Okay. So yeah, this is did this get it all started? I mean, this LaTanya Sweeney's really important work on advertising, where ads were suggesting that people with names that are traditionally African American were more likely to get these ads suggesting they'd been arrested. And that's a good comparative example, right? But there's others. Like, we've also heard in this conference about procedural. And I've ordered this list in an interesting way. I mean, it would make more sense if I ordered it in terms of importance, but it's kind of a talk about ordering. So what I actually did is I ordered it in terms of how likely I think it is for both parties in the social and technical to buy it. So I think procedural is very likely for them to buy it. It's easy to understand, and that's partly easy to quantify in some circumstances. So procedural, I don't need to go into it too much. We've heard reference to it in other talks this for. So for example, is your system doing the things that it said that it would do? Procedural could also include transparency, and it could include a bunch of other things, but I'm not going to talk about that. So this is a neat recent study from Matahari Esalami and co-authors, where they found that the hotel ranking algorithm used by Booking.com gave everything at the low end a bump. And so when the users would rank my hotel with a 1, Booking.com would put that in as a 2.5. And so this is interesting because the interface actually says 1, but then it comes out as a 2.5. So it's like, well, you said one thing, you did another. So this is just an interesting example. So the work's already being done that you could say is based in this idea of fairness. So all right, here we go. It's going to get harder to buy as we go, but I'm going to sell it. Abrahamic fairness. All right, Abrahamic fairness. So this is just the idea that humans are fallible, right? This is all I'm talking about. There's many definitions of this, but the kind I'm looking at is that humans are fallible, and it's hard to sell, but I think we can rename it. We can just make it more. This will work. I think we can sell this. Failure mode analysis. So for example, we put checks and balances in the Constitution, as someone pointed out. Drafted nearby. We put checks and balances in the Constitution because we know institutions don't work that well. So, you need to have those monitors on the traffic lights. You need to have those in the algorithmic systems. So that's a checkpoint right there. Like, did you do that? Do you have that? Where is it? So it's sort of a meta thing. It's like you make a monitor to see if there are monitors or something like that, right? So, all right, it gets weirder. Proportional, number 4, proportional. So again, this is just the idea from law of proportionality, and I think it's a reasonable sell. The problem is that as you go down my list, it gets harder and harder to agree on definitions of things. And so you get, back to SCS and everything's power, and what about complexity? But I think, saying that it's not the job of the technical people and someone else should make the decision isn't the right way. I think we could say, what would a monitor for proportionality look like? So, for example, this is a poorly worded prompt, but we do have systems that do something like a proportionality analysis in privacy, where they look at what kind of things the app is requesting, what kind of data, and is that commensurate with the kinds of things the app wants to do, and that's a proportionality analysis. So it's possible we could quantify some of this and code it, and I think it's not an approach we're really seeing much of. Okay. Restorative, it's getting harder and harder, but that's all right. So restorative, where am I? Oh, okay, sorry, I just lost my place, which is because paper is so good. Okay, all right. Proportional, restorative. All right, there we go. All right, guys. So, restorative, in restorative justice, the idea is just that those who are most affected should have the most say. And it's interesting because it conflicts so often with other notions of fairness or justice, right? So it's interesting because you said the victim gets to say what exactly happens to the offender in some cases, even if no one really thinks it's a good idea. But you feel like, well, that's what they want to do, so that's okay. I mean, that's not going to fly, but we could rename it something. I'm not exactly sure what, but something where you have groups that are affected by a system that have some weighting or something like that that gives them. This isn't an avenue that's been explored, and I think it promises some interesting results. I mean, there's some really clear examples. The recent work by Matthias, Rickman, and Steiner, where they looked at how Facebook profiled its users to decide whether or not the pride reaction icon would appear, is kind of an interesting way to think about that, right? Because in this case, if you imagine Facebook rolling this out globally, if a pride icon appeared and the user didn't have a good sense of how exactly the information is communicated to their network or who it would be visible to, they could actually do something that would get them in a lot of trouble, so arrested or something like that, right? And so that's an interesting way of thinking about it as a kind of restorative or participative way of thinking about this problem would be, these are the people who are most affected by it. So really, if you look at the community, if you look at like the LGBTQIA community, they're the ones who really are should be the ones who decide how this works, even if they're not you. So they should have more say, and we should work at. So number 6, Beneficient. So that, people know what that is, but the thing about this is that when I started trying to plug in these frameworks to real systems and come up with real examples, I came up with a kind of macro level problem. You could also call it don't be evil, but that didn't work. But the problem is if the system itself isn't pointing towards some good end, then none of the monitors work the right way, right? So if you attach the monitors to a system that does something you don't want, like a spam algorithm, right? Then it would invert the fairness, and it would sort of make people equally spammed, and you wouldn't want to do that, right? So there has to be some check where you say, like, is the overall thing working in a way that makes sense? And there is kind of an implementation of this, right? I mean, we have something like that. This is from the Chrome browser, where based on a variety of different signals evaluated by Google, they'll sometimes decide that a whole system isn't to be trusted, and they'll just sort of say, this site, people are squinting their eyes. You've never gotten this one? You guys need to browse the exciting part of the internet. All right. Anyway, it's real. Yeah. So, and then 7, Repugnant. Now, the interesting thing about the literature on fairness from the technical perspective is that I think there's a market for a lot more of it that's a lot more expansive about what we're trying to prevent, because really compliance is important, and God save the people who are protecting us from violations of the Civil Rights Act. That's good, but at the same time, the problems we've had with systems, we could call it fail-safes to make it more palatable. The problems we have with systems are often that they do things that we just absolutely don't want to ever happen. And so the idea of designing a kind of repugnance monitor. So this is the Tay tweets fiasco that you remember from 2 years ago, a year ago, something like that, where the AI was gamed by pranksters and became extremely anti-Semitic and racist and horrible. And so it started saying things like this to people. And so there's and it seems like this is a fairly obvious one, but we're not seeing a lot of, I see systems do things and I think, where's the repugnance monitor? Where did someone do a systems analysis and say, we absolutely don't want this to happen, so let's put in some little if-then there, let's do something, so we could see more of that. So all right, 8, awareness. This one you'd be surprised about, awareness. I think a lot of people don't even know that algorithmic curation systems are happening a lot of the time. And I used to think it was because they were uncommon, and as they became more common, people would, well, everything's filtered now. They would get it, but I think they still don't get it. I think that the reason this is a problematic one is that in particularly in interface design, we have the seamless ideal. And the seamless ideal is that computers work in a magical way where you put in some open-ended input and then you get some output and you don't know how that works. The problem with the seamless ideal is that you then, as Deirdre was actually talking about, you then don't know how the system works, right? So it's great if it works. If it doesn't work, it's not so great. There is actually a small but very fascinating literature on seamful design, which is a thing. And so that would be an interesting thing to explore in the context of monitors, something like that. Can we see that the algorithm is disclosed at all? Does the system tell people what are the different sorts that are being used, and how does that work? I don't have an example slide. Number 9, distributive. So this is I put almost last because it's it's going to be a hard sell, right? So, I mean, if you're concerned about distributive fairness, you're concerned about society as a whole, and it's very difficult to make some sort of neutral sounding statement that's going to pass at the ISO, right? So it's politics, it's power, it's everything. But I mean, still, I think it's on there. It's worth consideration. And then I actually, and maybe we call it something else. Like maybe we cloak it. I don't know, like some sort of macro. We'll call it something else. And then I ran out at 9. But I thought that the talk sounded dumb if it was the top 9 things. I thought it sounded dumb as a title. So I thought I would ask for others, because I think actually the expertise in this room far exceeds mine, particularly on the issues of reasoning about fairness. So then to end, this talk was actually a part of an initiative funded by the National Science Foundation at auditingalgorithms.science, which is a way to think, is try to come up with a research agenda beyond the first kind of fairness, beyond number 1, for people interested in technical and social things. So, and the film festival is really fun, so check that out. I'll stop there. Thank you for your time.
Is that your phone?
Oh, yeah. Oh, I went over. Damn.
But I have no idea how long I took, so it's okay.
Oh, yeah.
You were great. Number 10, suggestions? All right.
I'm thinking virtue ethics kind of didn't play a role up there, but I don't really know how that translates into a particular, maybe you can do it. I don't know.
All right, we'll come back to that. We have a suggestion for virtue ethics. What did you do to me, Kevin? All right. All right, so I'll be very short, very brief. And let me, I guess the way I'll organize my thoughts is how do we get to this being contestability and monitoring from where we are? What are the levers that have to be pulled? What are the incentives that have to be created? And then a couple of thoughts on your descriptions of what this is, the sort of ideal endpoint. So on how do we get to this, so Deirdre, you had said, this should be contestability should be a matter of policy and not procurement, which I thought was really interesting. And so I've been focusing on local government uses of predictive algorithms and have actually sort of concluded that it's the procurement process which has most of the heft in terms of if you wanted to require algorithms that were encoded with certain notions of fairness or had certain procedural windows for contestation or certain kinds of transparency requirements, the way you would get that is through procurement. And so I wanted to hear more about your thoughts on that. Other levers, and this also came up for me, Deirdre, in your comparison of the healthcare field and the criminal justice field. I mean, there are so many differences between those fields, and I wonder how relevant you think these are. So the ones that occurred to me are, you mentioned the role of the FDA in requiring that healthcare decision-making tools are assistive and not displacing of professionals, and we don't have that in most fields. We don't have, and so a lot of the conversations, I think yesterday, why can't we have someone like an agency like the SEC doing X or an agency like the FCC doing Y? And the fact is we don't have any agencies with jurisdiction to do some of the things that we want them to do. So here was an intervention by an agency, which then had these knock-on effects, which you thought were healthy. Another difference, distinctive feature of the healthcare system is that there's robust tort liability. And it seems that we've kind of been dancing around the role of liability and getting software or algorithmic machine learning systems to do the things we want them to do. What role does tort liability play? A final distinction that was top of mind for me was the role of doctors, right? And so one of the points you made was that, of course, we don't want to displace doctors. We don't want sort of algorithms to be an excuse for elevating, less skilled workers into the place of doctors. And so first of all, I thought, well, why not? Why don't we want to displace doctors, or why don't we want to retrain doctors, maybe make them lower skilled, because mostly what they're going to be doing is reading algorithmic predictions. And well, doctors don't want that to happen, right? And so doctors are a powerful professional guild, which are licensed by the state and have the AMA behind them, and coming from a law school and having a similar professional structure, we know how powerful that can be for sort of job protection and intervention into any sort of set of norms we might want to impose on an algorithm. I don't think we have that in the same way with parole officers. We do have that with judges, and I think that explains some of the Loomis decision, some of what was going on there. So that's just a question about what's the role of liability, and does it play out differently in different domains, and how do we want to address that? And then the third kind of feature I wanted to focus on the how do we get to this, is the role of institutions. And so the only preparation I did for this, because I knew you were going to talk about auditing, or I thought you were, but now it's called monitoring. But sticking with, it's sort of the same thing, right?
Sure.
Okay. Phew, then I get to say this. So I get to say then that auditing comes from the Latin to hear. And so, who are we listening to? And so the auditing, that I'm most familiar with is like financial auditing. Okay, so we know pretty much what we're trying to achieve with financial auditing is to, ascertain the truth of the profits and loss statements of companies, and that's been developed over, hundreds of years. Apparently, the first financial auditing was developed during the reign of Henry VIII, and then the locus of financial auditing moved from the United Kingdom to the United States, along with the locus of economic activity. And so, presumably, and so when I was thinking about auditing, and even us sitting here in the United States talking about what are we going to do about algorithms and where's the locus of economic activity moving to, it really doesn't feel like this is going to be our choice and our decision. And so what do we do about that? But in any case, back to auditing, with financial auditing, the other domain I'm somewhat familiar with is environmental auditing. There too, we have, it's a little more complicated, but we have kind of clear standards. We have regulatory agencies. We have things like the Fair Housing Act that get to be encoded, and that we can that can be revealed, and we can assess their accuracy. How do we even think about auditing in the context? And I think that's what you're trying to do with your checklist, is to kind of suss out some of these other softer areas. But with each one, and I missed a couple of them. I was taking notes, and I think I have like 8 and 6 blank. But for each of them, we can talk about repugnancy. Or now I don't even have my list. Abrahamicness, but what's the to what degree? So what is our definition of repugnancy? What sort of procedural checks are we kind of happy with, such that they can check it off? Those are all normative decisions. And then this gets me to sort of what is the this? And so contestability, so I assume one of the things contestability gives us is that we get to work that out, right? Like it's iterative, and we can contest whatever it is, however it is they checked this off or incorporated these values or norms into the system. We get a chance to contest it, and then it gets to be changed. And that raised for me this question of who is the we? And so in the healthcare example, it seemed to be that it's health professionals who would assess whether or not the algorithm has, as Catherine noted, like chosen the features that we think are relevant and weighted the factors correctly. What is the role of patients? Do they have a role? How do we think about kind of mediated systems where there's the ultimate, end user, and then there is the professional, whether it's a healthcare worker or a social worker or a probation officer. And when you use the term democratic governance, I wondered more kind of, how do we think about that? Because I think about democratic governance and algorithmic processes in a kind of a narrow context of the public institutions deploying algorithms where we can expect democratic governance. In these private spheres, have we ever had democratic governance? Should we have more? Is this an opportunity to have sort of new kinds of democratic governance that we haven't had in the past? And so what is the end user's role in that? And assuming that what contestability gives us is a chance to be iterative about this, and I was thinking about this in the context of the repugnancy feature. So say, it's hard to predict all the repugnant things that can happen, right? So you could check off, yes, I've considered, I've racked my brain for repugnant outcomes, and we have considered them, and there's going to be a fail-safe, but then something new comes along that they didn't consider, and there's a public outcry, and then this gets to sort of Kevin's point about governance, is what is the procedure then for factoring in the outcry, public outcry to the unanticipated repugnancy, and is that governance, how that will be dealt with, how has that been incorporated into the system? And I think this is, the problem many of us are having with Facebook is that it responds or it doesn't respond, and it over-responds, and it can't explain to us, why it's taken the steps it's taken. I just want to see if there's anything else I have to say. On just back, one other thing on, and this sort of ties together, institutions and auditing and how we understand this in this environment. So one of the things that struck me and that I struggle with myself is sort of, what do we mean when we talk about algorithms? I mean, there's no sort of, there's a machine learning field, but the way these algorithms are deployed in specific domains are totally embedded in those domains. And so, that's true of healthcare, that's true of policing. And so what are the institutions? We're not going to have kind of we have the computer science field and their institutions, but then we also have these parallel institutions within these domains, and how do they interact together? And so for auditing, financial auditing, we have the accounting field, and they have developed standards for their audits. And the same thing is true in a little more diffuse way in the environmental field. So who are the standard setters here? Is it like an international standard setting body? Is it within the distinct domains? Is it the healthcare domain sets their own, and how they interact with the machine learning community is up to them? So sort of how does this get worked out institutionally? So how should we do it? What do you think? I don't know how long you want to
We're
go.
running over, so maybe we should just take a couple of questions as opposed to responding, just so we get a few people from the audience. So yeah, we'll go as the mics, bring them around.
And then the next one down here.
Hi, I'm Steve Davidson from Brooklyn, a mostly retired emergency physician, and I have two quick thoughts. One, instead of repugnant, you might try non-maleficent, which is one aspect of the four basic principles of medical ethics. And two, the auditing process is evolving in medicine, and because medicine remains, thankfully so, tremendously decentralized, it's more or less robust in different organizations. However, in its more robust and effective manifestations, there are hotlines that can be called anonymously, reporting questionable issues that are then explored by a medical ethics committee, which has people who participate both from the hospital and from the community, and again, in the most robust manifestations, have had some formal training on the UN principles and other Office of Human Rights kind of stuff. Thank you.
I was going to say this even before you said your thing about the decision maybe not up to us. I think the 10th thing that you're looking for is global. Because if you look at how hard it has been to get countries to agree in things like the multi-stakeholder model for ICANN, and you look at China's very different agenda for the internet from Britain's or the United States or the rest of Europe, and the unknown agendas of developing countries, I think global is going to be a really, I think it's a very hard sell because every country thinks that their viewpoint is the right one.
One more, and then you guys can jump in.
I wanted to pitch slowness. And I was thinking about Jamie Teven at Microsoft had a thing called Slow Search for a while, and I was informed by slow food and slow parenting and slow travel and slow science. There's even slow reading. And then there was a New York Times article about depression a while ago that was about rumination and the way that like rumination is like cow stomachs processing food, but also like depressed people ruminate, and so many depressed people are poets and artists and academics because you need that slow rumination in order to like make ideas function. So I was thinking about like a slow algorithmic process, and I think it actually jives with the idea of like Mark Weiser's Seamful Design, where he talked about like the beauty of complexity that like could sort of like reveal itself to you over slowness. But my question is like, so I think that the list is like very provocative, and that's great and generative in that way, but when I think, and I can sit here and be like, but what about slowness? But I get so cranky when my search engine doesn't load my results, right? So it's like, so that's like a minor thing. It's like, how do we, like when the paradigm of when the dominant paradigm of our interaction with technology emphasizes speed, but also emphasizes all of these other things that are counter to these different modes of auditing, like how would we go about that?
Should we answer?
You should answer.
Yeah,
Want me to go first?
I don't care.
So thank you for all that. I mean, I think I'm just going to sort of double down on what I was originally doing. I mean, I liked your responses particularly, but I also think, I mean, what I may not have made it that clear, but what I was trying to say is that when we do interdisciplinarity, we over-rely on a sense of messianic conversion. Like we think that it'll work if we make the computer people like the philosophers or vice versa or something like that. But that's not what we want, right? There's epistemic reasons why technology people think one way, and so we don't want to mix everything together. So I think my proposal, perhaps better phrased in light of your remarks, would be that there's an opportunity at this moment in this domain of curation for what STS would call a trading zone, where you can produce something like a checklist, and it can act as a bridge between communities. And so, but to do that, in part, we have to kind of embrace reductionism or pigeon, and we have to say, instead of, let's teach virtue ethics to everyone. We have to say, like, what's a checklist that'll work, and it's not going to be as deep. It's going to avoid questions that you so rightly brought up about, like, whose values are you representing, or so it's not that I'm not aware of those, but I think there's just a moment right here, and the goal of the checklist is really to incentivize research, particularly in the community of people that have left. I see they were sitting right there. But no, it's just, no, I take that back.
I have
Oh, you
one.
have it.
So I guess I'll just say two quick things. So one, democratic governance norms, right? We would normally think of those as things that would apply to areas of governance, like that we think government governance. But I think it's important to think about the norms as things that promote political visibility, right? And when we think about building values, fairness, privacy, whatever, into technical artifacts, one of the things that people bemoan, right, is that one, we're going to lose the political visibility that a choice was made, right? That we chose equality over equity, whatever it is, or right? And thinking about the procurement process, right, where the benchmarks of a procurement process were the bids fair? Was there some sort of collusion? Was the pool of people applying diversity? Not that we're making important political decisions that we require this form of political visibility. And so while I well understand that the procurement process is where these things are happening, what I'm saying is that given that they're politics very far down, right, and that they risk becoming reified politics, hard to challenge, hard to see, literally disappearing into the infrastructure, that's a problem. We need to fix it, right? And so we need to actually figure out ways to ensure that it's not viewed like the acquisition of new pens, right? That these are not tools of this sort that have ISO standards, right? That these are informational, expressive, value-laden things that we need to be able to converse with, not just respond to, right? And then the second piece of that being that the contestability is, even if we do a lot of things on the front end, that for me, the reason I think it's super interesting to look at doctors and parts of, people who are doing bail or judges who are looking at there's similar kinds of systems, and yet, so it's not the technology that is driving this, right? It's just foregrounding the fact that, yes, issues of liability and professional commitment, and I think the populations who are being acted upon matter in how we think about the importance of contestability, transparency, interpretability, et cetera. And for me, the contestability piece is so important is that I think it maintains the hooks for ongoing professional engagement with the craft and the values and the norms. And if you look at the literature, like looking at risk recidivism software and what happens when people override it and they're like, oh, they get worse results. And I look at it and I'm like, they might have gotten more lenient results. But for people who are in law, that's not necessarily worse.
All right, with that, thank you. Some of you have already figured out that the lunch is across the way. The rest of you, there's food in the next room. We'll try and restart again at 1:30 to get back on schedule. This has been fabulous conversation, so I didn't want to cut it off, but take some time for